Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely gripping story about deception and, well, the incredibly elusive nature of the truth. We're going to be looking at a veteran crime reporter's literal, decades-long dance with a convicted hitman. I mean, think about it. How exactly do investigators separate fact from fiction when the person they're talking to makes their actual living out of lying? Okay, let's dive into this. To really wrap our heads around this story, we first need to meet our guide, veteran crime correspondent Jeff Edwards. Now, throughout his career, Edwards spent countless hours sitting face-to-face in a highly secure prisons with some of Britain's absolute most notorious criminals. We're talking everyone from East End gangsters to infamous serial killers. And after all those intense interviews, he came to a pretty stark conclusion. 99% of them are pathological liars. These are folks who will spin wild, elaborate fantasies just for a bit of attention, to manipulate the system, or, honestly, sometimes just to pass the time. So that brings us right to the core dilemma we're exploring today. If you're a journalist or a detective and you know for a fact that the person sitting across the table is lying to you 99% of the time, how on earth do you spot that tiny needle in a haystack 1% of truth? When a serial deceiver suddenly decides to confess to a horrific, completely unsolved crime, how do you know if it's a genuine confession or just, another chapter in their fabricated reality? To answer that, we really have to trust the expertise of the person actually asking the questions. And Jeff Edwards, he was uniquely qualified for this task. Over a massive 35-year career as a crime correspondent, he didn't just cover a handful of cases. No, he covered over 1,000 murders. Think about that for a second. He embedded with the police. He took firearms training. He even went undercover on major sting operations, like this one massive 50 million pound gold bullion heist at Heathrow. He knew the criminal underworld inside and out, and more importantly, he knew exactly how detectives thought and operated. And that brings us to the real antagonist of our explainer. Enter John Bruce Childs, a guy officially described as Britain's most prolific hitman. Childs was convicted of 6 brutal murders, which tragically included the killing of a victim's 10-year-old son. He had this extraordinary, horrifying penchant for violence, and his relationship with the truth, it was completely broken. Actually, back in 2003, the former Chief Justice Lord Woolf officially described Childs in the Court of Appeal as a pathological liar. This is the highly dangerous man that Jeff Edwards willingly sat down to interview. But why on earth did this hitman start talking to the authorities in the first place? And this brilliantly illustrates the mechanics of the criminal justice system at the time. It all started with a practice known as the Supergrass system. See, back in 1978, Childs was arrested for a massive armed robbery in Hertfordshire. It was a brazen 550,000-pound heist where his crew hijacked a security truck, tied up the guards, the whole shebang. They even wore their uniforms. The police, specifically the flying squad, offered Childs a deal: name other criminals, get a lighter sentence. They fully expected him to confess to more robberies. But instead, he confessed to multiple murders. Let's just walk through the timeline real quick so we can understand exactly how this unfolded. So Childs is arrested for that armed robbery in 1978. Then, in April 1979, a 60-year-old petrol attendant named Gordon Snowden is murdered. Seriously, keep that date in mind. It's absolutely crucial. By 1980, Childs' initial confessions land him a whole life tariff in prison. Then, nearly 2 decades pass by. It isn't until 1998 and 1999 that Jeff Edwards finally sits down and visits Childs at maximum security prisons like HMP Long Lartin and Franklin. Section 1. The one believable confession. During those late 90s prison interviews, Childs started claiming he had committed several more totally undiscovered murders. So how did Edwards know which one to actually believe? Now, what's really interesting about this comparison is the clear contrast in human behavior here. It essentially came down to the structure of the lies versus the truth. You see, for his fabricated murders, Childs was incredibly vague. No dates, no names, no exact locations. But when it came to the unsolved murder of Gordon Snowden, suddenly the fog completely lifted. Childs began providing these chillingly specific, verifiable details about a rainy night in Lincolnshire. Section 2. The truth in the details. Now, the murder of 60-year-old grandfather Gordon Snowden had completely baffled Lincolnshire police for 20 years. But sitting right there in a prison cell, Britain's most notorious hitman perfectly described a crime scene he supposedly had absolutely nothing to do with. Childs claimed that on that exact night in April 1979, he and his co-conspirator Henry McKenney were driving to Sutton Bridge, their macabre mission? To dispose of a car. Specifically, a Chevrolet belonging to their 5th murder victim, Ronald Andrews. The plan was to sink this car into the River Nene, and they had a Vauxhall with them to use as their getaway vehicle to drive back home.
Well, late at night, while on this incredibly grim road trip, things escalated tragically and suddenly. They stopped for petrol, and Childs made a spur-of-the-moment decision to just rob the till. He went inside, but the cashier, Snowden, was so nervous he literally couldn't remember how to open the machine. Frustrated, Childs lost his temper and struck the 60-year-old on the head with an iron bar. Snowden fell unconscious. Childs just grabbed the entire till, threw it in the back of the Vauxhall, and fled. He claimed he didn't even know he'd killed the man until he read about it in the papers a few days later.
Now, you might be thinking, anyone can just read an old newspaper and claim they committed a crime, right? And you'd be right. This is a huge, common problem for detectives. High-profile unsolved murders always attract false confessors. To combat this, police use a very specific tactic: withheld police evidence. Basically, they deliberately keep certain granular details of a crime scene completely out of the press. If a suspect comes forward and can accurately describe those secret details, well, the police know they are very likely talking to the real killer. Let's move to the evidence and see how this builds into an undeniable case. First off, detectives looked at their historical files and established as a hard fact that Childs and his partner actually were in that exact location in April 1979 to sink that Chevrolet. But the absolute aha moment, it was the till. Remember how I mentioned Snowden couldn't open it? Well, that's because it was a brand new, highly unusual electronic model for the time. Lincolnshire police had kept the specific details of that cash register a closely guarded secret for 2 decades, and yet John Childs described it perfectly. Honestly, the evidence was overwhelming. When Jeff Edwards took this exclusive story directly to the Lincolnshire police, they didn't just dismiss it. The major crime branch detectives sat down, they reviewed the withheld evidence, they reviewed the timeline, and they looked at Childs' extremely violent history, and they all came to a unified consensus. This pathological liar was, for this one specific horrific event, finally telling the truth. They had found the man who killed Gordon Snowden. Section 3. Confession without a conviction. Case closed, right? Well, not quite. As you'll see, having the truth and actually proving it in a court of law are two completely different things. When the police sent their files over to the Crown Prosecution Service, fully expecting a trial, the whole process just hit a brick wall. So the crucial point is understanding exactly why the justice system decided to halt this process. We can break it down into 3 main reasons. Number 1. Despite the confession, there was absolutely no surviving forensic physical evidence or independent witnesses from 1979 to put in front of a jury. Number 2, putting a known, documented, pathological liar on the stand carried a massive risk of him just retracting the confession purely for the attention. And number 3, practicality. Childs was already serving a whole life tariff. He was never, ever going to be released, regardless of a new conviction. Therefore, no prosecution followed. Which leaves us with a pretty profound dilemma to wrap up this explainer. The detectives know exactly who killed Gordon Snowden. The journalist knows. Even the killer himself admits it. Yet the official record will likely forever show this case as an unprosecuted, unsolved murder. It really forces us to ask, if a confessed truth never actually leads to a legal conviction, does it still count as justice? It's a wildly complex reality of our legal system, but also an incredible testament to the enduring power of investigative journalism to at least bring the truth to light, even when the courtroom doors remain firmly closed. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and hey, always keep questioning the details.